Okay, welcome, Dino, to a conversation with Seen and Heard. It's fantastic to see you today and for you to give us the time. Just love to start by you introducing yourself and giving us a little bit of background about what it is that you do.
Thanks, Chris, for having me. So, my name is Dino Nocivelli. I'm a solicitor and partner at Lead A Solicitors, predominantly based in London, but I've got clients all over the country and all over the globe. I specialize in representing abuse survivors, whether that's childhood abuse or abuse as adults. And I do an extensive amount of charity talks, training events, trying to help our clients to change the law with numerous campaigns and also raise awareness through the media.
Mm. Yeah, thank you very much, Dino. And who do you work for in London?
So I work for Lead A Solicitors in London.
Oh, fantastic, thank you. And as far as your what brought you to this work? What is it that has brought you into this element of the law?
I think it's a really important area on a number of different factors. So when you're dealing with someone who suffered abuse as a child, the impact on them can be so deep and so long lasting, and the ability to hopefully get a bit more understanding as to what happened and where wrongs have been committed is really important. Not only dealing with that abuse survivor, being able to raise awareness of this issue and trying to break the cycle of abuse, which is really important to me as a member of society, as a father, as a lawyer. Injustice is wrong. And I think in this area of life, sexual abuse, childhood abuse, it is so wrong. It's still happening. And anything which I can do to help to stop that, I'm very keen to do.
Mm. No, thank you for giving us a bit of an insight into that, and very much honour your work in this area. I know that we were introduced to each other by Alex Renton, someone who obviously is a great advocate in this area for giving a voice to people who suffered childhood abuse, particularly in boarding schools, independent schools as well in the UK. So that's what brought us together for this conversation, and we're creating some resources within our childhood abuse survivors hub within the Seen and Heard website to try and give people a bit of context if they have suffered and are survivors of abuse, some context of the system, the legal system, their options, what they might be up against when they do, if they do start to follow this path. For those who aren't following claim themselves, just some information that might not be available. So we'll be hosting that on our site. So thank you for your time today. With your role actually then as a legal ambassador for Seen and Heard, what have you come across in your professional experience when with relation to boarding schools, independent schools, and abuse claims? What have you seen in your career so far?
Obviously, abuse is horrendous and it can happen in every area of society. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. It can also happen at any time period. I think lots of people think that abuse may have happened in, 60s, 70s. We continue to see abuse to the current day. When we talk about those who suffer abuse in boarding schools, there are additional barriers. One may be sex or gender, whereby it's predominantly male abuse survivors. And there's inherent difficulties in men to talk about their emotions and feelings and mental health, let alone sexual abuse, especially when, 99 times out of 100, the abuser is also a male. In addition, boarding schools can cause significant issues in relation to attachment and disclosure and trusting people in authority and the time it takes place. That time when you're in a boarding school is the most important developmental stage of your life. If you think of those 5 years as an example, if you say 11 to 16 as an example, those 5 years, you enter puberty, you have your first sexual interaction, you decide what kind of music you like, what football teams you support, what you want to go into as a profession. If you suffer abuse during that key stage of your life, it can have a devastating impact on the rest of your life. And then if you compare, 30 to 35, 50 to 55, those 5 years, those original 5 years I mentioned, are so important. Boarding schools inherently, you're detached from your family, not only emotionally, but also logistically, physically, you're not with them.
Mm,
So if you do suffer abuse in that environment, who do you turn to? It is a problem. You have fear of being believed. You don't know where to turn. You don't know, understand what's happening. You can't contact others. It's so debilitating, to be totally frank. And there's been lots of grey areas in relation to boarding schools for a long period of time. So, for example, corporal punishment, so smacking children, was banned in state schools in 1986, but it wasn't banned in independent schools, boarding schools, and the like until 1999. So, a 13-year gap is one example. Again, in a state school, you go back home to your family. There's still barriers to disclose. It's still difficult to tell someone, by the way, I suffered sexual abuse or child abuse from my teacher today. But as a boarding school pupil, you are taught to be emotionally resilient and self-dependent from a very young age. When most people are doing this from the age of 16 and 18 or onwards, as a boarding school pupil, you're doing this from a much younger age.
mm,
And that does in itself cause problems. There's lots of research talking about potentially boarding school syndrome, let alone adding on that other layer of actually, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse in a boarding school. So there are inherent issues with this, and lots of children board from an extremely young age,
mm,
which can inherently cause problems. The last factor, which is very important, is that if you went to a state school, most people do not have a symbol on them, a ring, a signet ring, let's say, or a feeling that they are um, uh, an ex-Etonian or Suttonian or Caldicotian or anything else. You just went to St. Joseph's School. You didn't go to Eton or Horace Hill or anywhere else. That can cause problems because it feels like you're suing a family member, which in essence they were. Remember, you grew up with them, you ate with them, you showered with them, you watched sport with them, you did sport with them. That in itself can be a huge barrier. And when we're talking about pretenses and keeping the status quo, lots of our clients who suffered abuse in boarding schools face a real dilemma when they have children, or if they do have children. Do we send our children to a boarding school? I haven't told anyone about the abuse. Do we have to sustain that lie? And often you do. And people feel obliged to continue it because they can't talk about it. It causes huge trauma. So, for those people who suffer abuse in boarding schools, every abuse survivor has barriers and difficulties, but there are a number of them which are exclusively for people who attend boarding school, let alone the guilt and trauma which flows from it, including, you know, my parents have paid for me to have the privilege of this education. Um, and sometimes, not every person attending has very rich parents. Not every pupil attend, payments were made. Some were on bursaries and the like, or grants. That is also an additional barrier. And then when you know others have suffered abuse, or perhaps your siblings have attended after you,
mm.
that familial guilt, self-blame, can be extremely damaging,
Mm.
to be frank.
Yeah.
So those are some of the factors which
Mm.
are in play for boarding school pupils who suffer abuse.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dina. I can resonate with a lot of what you're saying there. Obviously, having come through the system, the boarding school system myself from 6 years old, the one thing you touched upon there, which I think is certainly from a lot of the people that access Seen and Heard services who come and talk to us, was the normalization of the abuse that they went through at schools. Certainly, as you mentioned, corporal punishment. There was the fagging system that was in place for decades, which led to a lot of abuse, physical, verbal, and sexual. Older boys on younger boys, or older girls on younger girls. And then, yeah, the impact of the kind of closing ranks around the institution. So people who were abusers being moved between schools, rather than the school sort of handling the abuse at the time, the kind of closing ranks around the institution, protecting the school's name. And as you say, for many people like me, who were sent away from parents at 6 and those attachments were broken, yeah, the school in a way becomes mother and father in loco parentis, if you like, and yeah, those loyalties run deep, as you say. So sort of outing the system that raised you is very, very difficult. So thank you for talking into some of those points. You mentioned boarding school quite a lot within what you were saying. Do you see cases coming from day pupils in independent schools, or is it predominantly from the boarding side of things?
Yeah, no, we do see allegations and abuse convictions for day pupils as well. The Again, this is quite sad, but purely logistically, abuse usually takes place one-on-one. So if you're in a classroom between 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. as an example, it's often very difficult to get a child one-on-one. So even though we do see abuse of day pupils, 100%, it's usually after classes as such, or at night, or when people are dorm masters and the like, where abuse does take place. Or come back to my dorm, you can watch TV, you can watch Top of the Pops, you can have some ice cream, you can use my shower. Those small privileges, also known as grooming and manipulation,
Mm-hmm.
then often does lead to abuse. And again, if you're suffering bullying or you're homesick or there's other issues going on in your life, someone looking after you, like you said, in local parentis, a dad or a mum going, it's all right, come back, we'll watch some TV, you can watch James Bond. Next thing you know, the abuse is now started. It is so, so difficult
Yeah.
and in play. But yes, day pupils also suffer abuse
Mm-hmm.
and lots of borders, sadly, especially abuse in evenings, at the night time, which sadly creates its own problems in relation then to sleeping. Later on in life, nightmares, flashbacks, uncertainties, other people being in your bed, wife, husband, girlfriend, boyfriend, and whatnot. But that is often where lots of the abuse takes place, sadly.
Yeah, thank you for expanding on that, Dino. Yeah, I mean the key things we see in um, ex-boarding school pupils, ex-independent school pupils, and particularly those who've suffered verbal, physical, sexual abuse, hypervigilance in adult years, issues in relationships, and then nearly always some sort of unhealthy coping mechanism or addiction to remain functional, if you like. So it might not be classic sort of substances and things like that. Could be behavioural stuff. So yeah, gambling, control, workaholism, alcoholism being the kind of 4 or 5 of the key ones that seem to present in these cases. And you can understand that when that healthy attachment and development is disrupted by day on day neglect, if you like, of being away from the family system, then compound that with perhaps, unfortunately, some key episodes of abuse of some kind or another, and the survival mechanisms that child has to build up, and the beliefs that they make about themselves and the world as a result of those things that happen to them, we see last for decades and decades, for people coming to see us in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And often with disclosing abuse, I think it was you who told me that it can take decades. What do you see in abuse survivor disclosures as how long it can take sometimes? Yeah.
Yeah, so obviously the data is only based on those people who do come forward, to be totally frank, but there's numerous research pieces, including independent inquiry into childhood sexual abuse, ICSA, which generally speaking, the findings is it takes roughly 30 years to disclose. So if you suffered abuse when you're 10, roughly speaking, you're 40. Now we know it takes men 4 to 6 years longer than women to disclose. But again, that is an average. And it's only the people who do disclose. So how many people will never talk is likely to be a lot higher. And we appreciate these things are probably are the tip of the iceberg. The reason why people disclose, let's say in their 40s on average for ease, numerous reasons. Sometimes it's because they have children the same age they were when they were abused. So let's say I'm 40 now. I've got a 10-year-old child, let's say. I suffered abuse when I was 10. That can bring it home. Sometimes if they're 40, their parents may have passed away because they're 70, 80. and that enables them to talk. Sometimes it's because they've seen a news story, something in the media, which has triggered them. There's numerous reasons for doing that. But generally speaking, most of our boarding school clients are 40s, 50s, if not older. And one thing which is really important is that when we talk in the media about, come forward and talk, that is right. That's an important step. But ideally, we want people to talk much sooner, and being able to obtain that kind of therapeutic support to be able to speak to the police and obtain convictions before abusers pass away. If we can get the average age of disclosure down from 40 years old down to 14, it would make such a big difference, because the therapy, the educational support, the criminal system, it would stop other children from suffering abuse. It would hopefully stop that child from the continuation of the abuse and the impact in their lives. It is such an important measure. Saying that, I've been doing this work for over a decade, and the average age of disclosure still hasn't moved. So even though more people are coming forward and talking about abuse, they're still disclosing 40s, 50s year olds. We still get people disclosing in their teens and 20s and 30s and so on, but proportionately, it's still roughly the same proportion. And that's what's concerning, in that if someone's suffering abuse today, the trauma, the difficulties, the barriers, the people in positions of trust, the fear of being believed, the guilt, the self-blame are the same today in 2024 as they were in 1984. And when we see clients now, 12, 13 speaking to us, it's exactly the same as when we see a 40-year-old man or a 50-year-old woman talking to us about their abuse. So my fear is that the abuse is continuing to roughly the same level. And obviously, there's different forums now: digital, child abuse images, child abuse videos, AI, and other forums. But people are still disclosing it in their 40s or 50s. Sadly, it doesn't seem to be slowing down, which is a real concern.
Yeah, thank you, Dino. That's extremely sad to hear that there hasn't been much change. And actually, your data on and the ICSA data on the age of coming forward, if you like, correlates almost identically with the age that people start to realize perhaps their school years or their childhood years
Yeah,
may or have had an impact on their adult lives. We see most people coming to the Seen and Heard service looking for well-being support, looking for specialist therapists, coming to the connection groups and things like that. They are typically 40 and over, and they are just starting to put the pieces together for those three key reasons. They don't have to protect their parents anymore, which is what a lot of people are doing. They have got kids around that same age, or are perhaps becoming uncles, aunts, and things like that, of kids around about that same age. So you suddenly look down and realize how vulnerable and fragile these young people are, and you think, my God, at that age I was doing X, Y, and Z, or having these things done to me. So it sadly correlates, and at Seen and Heard, we are trying to use the raising of awareness to bring that age down from a harm reduction stance. The harm to the individual, their family, their community, and wider society of getting the right support early is immeasurable. And well, thank you for your work in that area, and for being a legal ambassador for Seen and Heard, and supporting what we're trying to do as well.
thank you.
Thank
Just picking up on that, if that's all right, Chris, is it obviously, the Labour government is it is going to impose VAT now on private schools and boarding schools and the like, and a huge chunk of that money is to provide mental health provision in state schools. We are going to have to see if that is replicated in boarding schools, in private boarding schools, because I think it is really important. If we are able to get therapists, counsellors, mental health support in schools, and to raise this as an issue, hopefully we can break the taboo of abuse much sooner in someone's life. Not every child is going to disclose, I know that, but if one does, it would make a significant difference. The tax is for state schools, as far as I'm aware. So will private boarding schools replicate it? They should do. I hope they do. But we just don't know. But that is a really important measure. And again, we're very keen to work with schools and scouts and the government and other bodies to try to break the cycle of abuse. That's the only way we're going to do it. for exactly the same reasons you just mentioned.
mm,
Prevention, reduction is the only way to fix this issue. There is no cure. I have not created a magic clock which can turn back time. I wish I could. And until that happens, we're going to have to keep on working on this. But obtaining therapy after the abuse is important, but the sooner you can get that help and making sure it's specialist, it is so key. You
mm,
do need to work with someone who's specialist, who knows about abuse, and ideally boarding schools as well. You need to be able to build rapport. So do you want to work with someone who's 60 or 30? Do you want to work with male, female? Do you want to do virtual or in person? Having those options is so, so key to get the most effectiveness from therapy. But I just wanted to pick up on that one point about
mm,
how do we bring down the age of disclosure, keep on raising awareness, keep on doing what Seen and Heard is doing and is pursuing. But
mm.
I'm really keen to get Seen and Heard in, ideally boarding schools and the like, to say it's not us against them.
No.
We're all in this together. No one should want abuse to happen. No one, of course, does want abuse to happen. So let's root it out. We're all against abuse. We're all against abusers.
Mm,
Let's get this provision in place. But I just don't know where these schools are going to find the extra money from, or how parents of children attending these schools are going to find extra money from. I don't know what's going to happen. So we'll have to see from September 2024
yeah.
onwards, I suppose.
Yeah, thank you, Dino, for bringing that up. I think we're at Seen and Heard. We are writing to independent schools and boarding schools in September, October this year to ask for a dialogue, around this, to look for gold standard practice that's happening and to share that. Who's doing what well and getting that out, news out there across the schools, to ask them to put in place funds, and bursaries for supporting ex-pupils. So pupils who come through their schools who are now suffering in adult life, perhaps not as a direct result of exactly something that happened at the school, like an abuse allegation or something, but just from uh, uh, the result of detachment, abandonment, relationship issues, alcohol problems, even now, not within boarding necessarily, but just the relentless timetabling at these schools where the kids are doing 60-hour weeks, 6 days a week. There's no downtime, even for the day pupils and things, and that's leading to burnout. It's leading to workaholism, alcoholism, and things. So we just want to have a dialogue with the schools that says there is an impact of the way you are educating, and there will be people who need support services as a result. So please put funds in place to help, and allow contact with the alumni groups, with the ex-pupils, to allow us to speak to them and offer independent services, where they feel it's outside of the institution, if you like, where this mistrust of institutions you've talked about, and just come talk to some people who've been through it, who have the connections and signposting and resources to help. So that's one of the big things we're asking for around ex pupils, and then of course for the current pupils, we want to share best practice and just make sure the kids are being set up for, if they're going to claim to give the best education, it has to be an incredible emotional education as well. So kids need to be sent out into the world not just with brilliant grades and being fantastic at sport, but also to be the leaders of the future. And that requires emotional awareness, intelligence, and a secure human being underneath it all.
Yeah.
And so that's the conversation we want to have. And we know there'll be some forward-thinking schools who will engage. There will be others who will be resistant, but change is coming, and we believe that the schools will want to be on the right side of that change.
Just the one thing which you mentioned is about, boarding schools providing education. They, if they are truly in loco parentis, which is what they are, boarding schools don't just educate, they raise a child, and they should care for a child. And often those last two components don't have the same um, uh, energy to it, perhaps, and the focus is on education. That's when you talk about the 60-hour week. We see this with mums and dads who have, tennis prodigies or football potential stars, and you're called a pushy parent, an excessive parent. and then sooner or later they just hate the sport. I don't want to play tennis, can't see tennis or anything at all. What we're talking about, again, it's really important to have a well-rounded individual. Otherwise, if you become emotionally stunted and you have any trauma in your life, divorce, deaths, sexual abuse, how can you process that when you can't process quite basic emotions and processing? It is a huge concern. So I think that's a really important thing to say. Boarding schools don't just educate, they are similar to homeschooling. You've got to make sure you have a well-rounded individual, which includes caring for them and raising a child, which is what you're doing in essence as a boarding school. So I just think it's a really important measure to put in place. And I think there are some really good schools out there, to be frank. And most people come into this profession to do the right thing and the good thing. Saying that, we have seen numerous cases whereby people haven't done the right thing, whereby people perhaps maybe were aware of abuse or have seen abuse or been told about abuse and then don't act on it, don't report it to the police and the authorities, don't remove the teacher from their job. It's devastating. The reasons why people do it numerous. It could be because they were complacent, incompetent, negligent, covering up for the school, wanting to keep the prestige, the goodwill, and wanting to retain the fees which would come from that pupil and others, because obviously it's bad press to have a child abuser in your school. But there are lots of good people which we need to protect. And the fact is, if you do whistleblow, you do raise these concerns, you could lose your job and profession. So one of the key things our clients are keen to do, and so are we, is to get mandatory reporting in place. It's a really important campaign to take the burden away from abuse survivors and to say it's the responsibility for everyone. You know, it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a village to abuse a child, to be totally frank. And we do need a lot more support in place. But I'm very keen to stress that most teachers, most men, most schools are good, caring environments. But it's when good people allow bad things to happen, that's when we have significant problems and systematic failings. And that's why, again, we're very keen to push for mandatory reporting to be made a law as soon as possible.
No, thank you very much for touching on mandatory reporting. It's something that Seen and Heard, we're very much behind the campaign to see that brought in. When we've touched on abuse, and I think as someone who's not from a legal background, and some of the things that I saw at boarding school, coming through as a child, and countless stories we hear at Seen and Heard from abuse survivors who come and talk to us about their stories. Many, because it was so normalized, a lot of this abuse within the school structure, within the institution, like you say, special privileges, they were everywhere, and certain masters, certain instructors, and would run these clubs that were very select, and there would be extra time away from the dorms, or there would be trips, or there would be tea and biscuits and all this sort of stuff. If you were to get into small groups with some of these people, a lot of people are going to ask, well, what even is abuse? So if someone wanted to pursue a conversation with a law firm, with a legal avenue, sexual, verbal, physical, it's quite complex for a lot of people to know, okay, well, what actually is abuse? So could you help me understand that a little bit?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely fair. It's a difficult area, to be frank. And when most people talk about abuse, they're talking about childhood sexual abuse from a teacher to a pupil, can also involve peer-on-peer abuse. So an older pupil to a younger pupil, and the school being aware or should have been aware that this was a risk and this was happening and didn't act appropriately. It can also involve racial abuse as well. I've dealt with a number of racial abuse cases, alleged racial abuse cases at Chelsea Football Club. It can involve emotional and verbal abuse, which again we're acting on currently. So alleged body shaming at a number of different ballet schools, which they are full-time boarders. It can include physical abuse. Again, the problem which we've got in boarding schools is that it was so commonplace being smacked and hit that it's hard sometimes to distinguish what was a typical example of corporal punishment and what was a beating. And some of the examples which we have heard of and spoken to survivors about, being smacked is one thing, being thrown down the stairs, thrown against radiators, having your head smashed against walls. That isn't corporal punishment. That isn't being smacked with a slip or a belt or anything else. It is hard to distinguish, and often abuse survivors, sometimes from self-preservation, will not acknowledge that something to be abuse. We've had a couple of cases, well, a number of cases whereby you are speaking to someone, they're talking about sexual abuse, and then half an hour later they say, oh, by the way, yeah, this happened to me, quite extreme physical abuse. But they don't consider it to be abuse because it was so normal. And that's the problem. Everyone's normal is their own normal. And I appreciate that. But in boarding school, the stuff people see and hear and then experience themselves, often lots of things are let go, and it's wrong. It's entirely wrong. Obviously, post 99, you can't smack a child, so it's much easier to distinguish, why are you being hit by a teacher. Pre 99, there's problems, and the same as the discrepancies. So why are you being smacked for speaking at night? What's the reasonable punishment for that? One smack, 10 smacks, 100 smacks, smack with a hand, smacks with a stick? What is reasonable? That's the difficulty with physical assaults, to be totally frank. Predominantly, we're looking towards sexual abuse because it's quite clearly wrong. Things like emotional abuse, racial abuse, body shaming, again, are cases which we are working on and succeeding on to prove that this is abuse. But I think that abuse in the eyes of the law and abuse in the eyes of a layperson are very different. And I think any action which causes you trauma, discomfort, upset, distress, is abuse. That's my view on it. Because the fact that you can recollect it and you still experience a feeling and pain and suffering from it, that must be classed as abuse, even if it's not abuse in the eyes of the law, because it's difficult to prove that these acts took place and that they were abusive. It's important for your listeners and viewers to consider, what do I want to achieve? Do I want to go down the criminal process, pursue a civil case, obtain therapy, speak to friends and family to explain this is why I don't like going to change rooms, this is why I self-medicate with drink or drugs. Perhaps they want to be involved in an inquiry. There's numerous things, but what I'm very keen to stress is that no abuse is more serious or not to any other. It's all about severity and the impact, with total respect. We've had clients who've suffered the most serious and severe sexual abuse you can think of, but their impact sometimes is I say surprisingly, but it's much more reduced than what you would perhaps anticipate. When others have suffered different forms of abuse, everyone deals with things in different ways.
Mm.
And I think every form of abuse needs to be considered, because also what we sometimes call it is the kind of low level concerns. But every single low level concern or form of abuse enables then other abuse to take place, because it creates an environment whereby this is accepted. So if you start racially abusing me and then physically abusing me, well, quelle surprise, now sex abuse is taking place, because the others have set forth a platform whereby teachers and housemasters are able to do this to pupils with no ramifications, no impact.
Yeah.
It gives you carte blanche as an abuser. And often we see abuse then, even if it's sexual abuse, starting off relatively low level and severity, but it will increase because then more and more they feel comfortable and needing to sexually abuse to a higher level and more children and higher frequency and duration. For the child, they will see and witness this. So what's the point of me telling about Mr. Smith?
Mm.
When he's been here 25 years, he started off as a teacher, now he's headmaster. Who the hell is going to believe me? It creates that fear. So that's when we talk about abuse. Every form of abuse against a child which causes harm must be taken seriously and acted on.
Yeah.
If we don't, it will fester and it will grow and spread like cancer.
Yeah,
It is
definitely.
really serious.
Yeah, thank you, Dina. That's really helpful to explain a little bit. And actually, I found myself, as you were talking, bringing some things to mind of time at boarding school where I went through in the mid to late 80s and early 90s. And because the law was changing, the schools were phasing out the corporal punishment whilst I was there.
Yeah.
And quite cleverly and slightly sadistically changing the punishments, if you like. So it became you would run laps of the field until you were sick, as a for instance, which was sort of phased in instead of caning, slippering, and being hit with a trainer. But the running of the laps till you were sick, having done it, was a really awful thing, because you think you have to keep going, because you don't want to sort of let people down, and you don't want to show weakness and all these other things. So in the trauma world, it's not necessarily always what happens to you, it's what happens inside as a result. And the belief that you make about yourself that day could be the one that underpins your difficulties as an adult, which is, I must keep going, I cannot show weakness, I cannot show, they will not get the better of me. All those kind of beliefs that can really drive you into some pretty seriously dark places as an adult. So thank you. And if someone is watching this and they're thinking back to their time at school, or as a young person, in general, what would your advice be if some things have happened that you know it? There's thinking, feeling, and knowing. You know when something's wrong. If they know something was wrong, what should they do about that, if they're thinking that they want to bring this to light and perhaps pursue a legal avenue?
Yeah, I think that if you are able to talk, it's really important to break that silence. We have seen so many times the kind of ripple effect from doing that. So speaking to a lawyer is a good step just to get advice and signposting. So, this is what's happened to me. What do I do? Where should I go? A specialist abuse lawyer can give some guidance and signposting in relation to the police, criminal process, direct signpost to therapy, specialist therapy. Perhaps people want to consider inquiries or investigations and the like. But I think that's really important. That ripple effect isn't just for that person individually, whereby it can be quite cathartic to shed, to an extent, that kind of burden, and to say, look, it wasn't my fault. I was abused. I am an abuse survivor. Just to say those words is very important. That's the first ripple. Second, then, is for their partners, parents, children, friends, and family, because often people around you may know, well, that's just the way you are. But saying to them, actually, I suffered abuse, that makes sense. That ripple effect. And okay, well, that's why you don't allow us to have sleepovers, Dad. That's the reason why I can't go on a football trip, Dad. That kind of makes sense now. We understand that ripple. But the third ripple, which is really important, is breaking the cycle of abuse. We know, sadly, that an abuser, and to date, in every single case I've ever acted in, it's been true. An abuser has never just abused one individual, sadly. They've always abused others. Whether it's a teacher, football coach, priest, rabbi, the list goes on, they always have. So that ripple effect could enable others to obtain the same ability to disclose their own abuse. And one thing we have noticed, even if other people did not abuse the same thing in that school, Eton as an example, by speaking to friends and other people and breaking the taboo, we've had it again today. We did a Times piece about Horace Hill School. That person spoke to two of their friends. They both disclosed their own abuse, but not about Horace Hill School. One was by another school, and another one was by her grandfather. They've been friends for like 30 years, never been able to talk about it. You can see how that ripple effect is good and helpful. Those two individuals hopefully will be able to tell others and be able to disclose and break the taboo of abuse. And that's what we need, I think, in this country for far too long. The ability to talk about sex and abuse and wrongs being committed have been so hard. So if someone is able to talk about their abuse, then please do seek and obtain specialist help, whether that's through solicitors and or therapy. But whoever you speak to should be signposting you to these different things. And it's important to understand what you want to achieve from it. But things can and should get better from you disclosing. It's a really important measure to take.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dina. That's really clear. And a couple of things you mentioned there are so importantly, you talk about getting specialist therapeutic support and help. And yeah, that anyone entering any sort of legal avenue or disclosing abuse for the first time, having the right therapeutic support by your side to even find the words of how to share with family, of what the impact might be on jobs and kids and communities of this new piece of information, um, and to begin a healing process, so that if a legal avenue is pursued, it's not from a rageful, vengeful place necessarily. It's from a clean anger that is about instigating change, about righting wrongs, about ensuring these things don't happen again, and it's almost part of a therapeutic process, but not um, uh, is sort of the end goal itself, if you like. So yeah, thank you for highlighting that. And uh, yeah, I think you touched on as well that there are cases coming through from the old days, if you like. So a lot of the institutions will always say, well, it's not like that anymore. We've tightened up on all the pastoral care and all the safeguarding stuff. The dodgy teachers are all gone now. Everything's fine. What would you say to that, if based on who is coming to speak to you about cases and things like that? Is it that things have just changed over the years? Are cases still coming forward?
Yeah, I think that um, it always gives people a sense of security and safety to say this was historic abuse. These were historical issues.
Mm,
And whenever I do any talks or media piece, I always say this, in that you do not say historic kidnapping, you do not say historic or historical murder or theft or anything else. It's the only offence which you do that to as a society. And why is that? It's a problem back in the day. In the 80s, it was historical. This is what we talk about. People used to say something similar for racial abuse,
mm,
but racial abuse continues to the current day. You can have as many policies as you want, but racial abuse and racism continues to the current day, and racial discrimination. With sexual abuse and sexual discrimination, we had the Me Too movement, we've had the Black Lives Matter movement. We still have disparities and abuse and discrimination to the current day. When we're talking about childhood sexual abuse, people perhaps appreciated abuse within the Catholic Church, the 80s and 90s, perhaps, or things were a bit rough in boarding schools. That's what people say. Or as one mother once told me, it's a small price to pay for a good education. Take a stiff upper lip. You're going to be okay. You're going to be all right. It's really damaging. It's not right. And we will continually see, 2011, 2012, abuse by a celebrity, Jimmy Savile. 2016, abuse within football. 2020 onwards, abuse within gymnastics, the Scouts, state schools, different religions, different sports, family home, children's homes. The list continues to keep on going. And the fact, even though the loopholes are closing and we're very keen to continue to do that, there are still quite significant loopholes and abuse is still happening. We are still seeing criminal cases involving teachers whom we convicted in the last couple of years for recent abuse and non-recent abuse as well.
mm,
It is complacent to say just because we haven't had allegation against our school in the last 5 or 10 years, therefore it's not happening. It totally belies the actual issue which you're facing. Are people totally accessible, totally open, totally transparent, making sure it's an independent voice? If something came forward, what would you do as a school, which you wouldn't have done previously? And is there that kind of second going, well, do we want to cause disruption to this child? Perhaps we should encourage parents just to let it go. We've got rid of the teacher, let's not pursue it any further. We do see those things happening, but we do know abuse is continuing to the current day. We see that in the allegations, we see that in the survivors we represent, we see that in the criminal cases as well. People say, well, it's not the same as the allegations in the 80s, but again, it's not looking at how long it takes people to disclose. I promise you, a 15-year-old now is a very similar 15-year-old as when we were 15. Fair enough, now they have Instagram and TikTok and whatnot, and you didn't have phones, and I didn't have that, you know, I said a snake might knock you back in the day. But the issues in play are very similar. You're a 15-year-old trying to understand your sexuality, trying to be as normal as everyone else, not wanting to create a scene, trying to think, well, did I lead them on? Is it my fault? Why did they choose me for? And all of these other factors. What would my dad say? What would my mum say? Will friends pick on me? Will friends make comments about me? Will anyone believe me? The teacher's so popular. He's been there 20 years. Everyone loves him. No one's gonna like be on my side. What if everyone finds out about it? Those fears are exactly the same. And what we have seen with some of our clients who have suffered abuse in schools is that social media can be truly evil. So all of those fears are often borne out. So people will know Dave hasn't been in school for the last 2 months. But then the teacher's also gone off. He's been charged with abuse. Dave must have made an allegation against that teacher. And
Mm.
then the social abuse that is absolutely vile. And that can be extremely damaging and impactful. So again, one thing I would say with schools is that it's complacent to think, seeing as people have not made an allegation right now, it's not continuing. That isn't the case. It
Mm.
is continuing. And what we need to make sure is that people feel able to talk and that we not only do we listen, that we act on it. I don't think we can rely on people's morals to act on it any longer. That's why, I'm fully supportive of Seen and Heard in their campaign for things like mandatory reporting.
Mm.
It is so crucial to say that we're all in this together. And you're not a hero for disclosing abuse as a teacher. You're not a whistleblower. You should be just doing your legal duty, your human duty. Instead, they are heroes
Yeah.
because if they come up against the system, you usually get your head knocked off.
Yeah.
And that can affect your career opportunities. You may lose your job or be affected. We've seen similar things, with the grooming gangs in Rotherham and Rochdale, whereby people did try to raise concerns and wasn't listened to for whatever reason, similar to the Catholic Church and elsewhere in sports
Yeah.
clubs. It takes a very brave person to do that.
It
What we
does.
should be doing is should be a statutory duty for you to do it, and that way it would help so many children to say that you're not alone. We're in this together,
Mm.
and you can talk to us. We're obliged to act on it. It is so important.
Yeah, thank you so much for clarifying that. And particularly for people who aren't familiar with mandatory reporting, I think you've really explained it there, those clear lines of of reporting incidents and having that duty to do so rather than sort of being a singular hero. It's your responsibility. So to sort of bring this together a touch. So we've looked at kind of what abuse might be, how to resource yourself should you start to want to talk about this or to speak to go to a legal route, speak to your family. So you might have looked back at what has happened to you. You know something's wrong. You then maybe find the right specialist support so you feel supported in starting to talk about that with a professional, form your own opinion, your own language around it. What would the process then be for an abuse survivor? Perhaps if they wanted to take a legal avenue, what would they do next?
So, first things would be we'd be advising to report to the police. Um, if it leads to a criminal prosecution, that's one thing. If the abuse is dead, if there's insufficient evidence, that's another issue which we often have to face. People need to remember someone like Jimmy Savile was never charged or convicted of abuse, but we know balanced probabilities he was a child abuser. Um, After the criminal process is concluded, either positively with a conviction, or if not, because of insufficient evidence or abuse is dead, is to then pursue a civil action. We would look to rely upon the police statement as a key piece of evidence. We don't want abuse survivors to repeat their abuse to us all over again and cause additional trauma. There will be additional questions we probably will have compared to the police, with total respect to them. We would then send a draft letter of claim to the defendant, in this instance, the boarding school. They would have 3 weeks to acknowledge it and then 3 months to provide their substantive liability response. That's them saying, yes, we agree, the abuse happened. We agree that we should be held vicariously liable. So that means that we should be held responsible for the actions of the alleged abuser, and that we now want to negotiate. Alternatively, they may say you're out of time to bring a civil case. You should have started your civil case by your 21st birthday and registered it at court, and you're out of time, and we can't have a fair trial now because documents are destroyed, abusers are dead, witnesses are no longer available, and or maybe we dispute the abuse. There's no convictions. How can you prove that this man is an abuser, or the abuse did not take place during the course of his employment? It's totally separate to his role at the school. So what happens is that we get the police statement, we meet the client, we send the letter to the school. They have, let's say, 4 months for ease to come back to us with a response. They admit it, they want to address the matters, or they deny it. If they admit it, during those 4 months, we would arrange for you to see a consultant psychiatrist, a medical expert, to provide their opinions on any injuries you've suffered, including psychiatric injuries. When do they start? What's the severity? What's the impact on your life in relation to education, employment, relationships, drink, drugs, self-harm, gambling? Not from just when the abuse started, but continuing. What therapy is recommended? How much is there need for kind of further courses of therapy if there's relapses over the rest of your life? And crucially, what caused it? Was it because your parents divorced when they were 10? Was it because your grandmother died when you were 12? Was it because you saw your dog got run over when you were 13? Or was it because you suffered significant and serious sexual abuse from your housemaster or teacher or someone else? What caused it? What was the material contribution? Because again, we appreciate everyone's lives formed by different manners. We're not trying to retrospectively reattribute all issues in your life to the abuse, but often the abuse is the common thread and the main and significant factor because it happened during that key developmental stage of your life. And it's the thing which you have potentially flashbacks or memories or triggers of, which you don't have for the other issues I just mentioned. Now, if they admit liability, if they say we want to engage in negotiations, we would use that report to negotiate with the other side in relation to the kind of pain and suffering elements. That's the personal loss to you, the personal injury and loss to you, but also looking towards special damages. And that means the cost of past therapy and travel, cost of future therapy and travel, potential self-harm, corrective surgery, potentially education and employment impact. So let's say you didn't go to university and become a graduate, but all of your family did, and both your parents went to university and all your peers went to university. That graduate earnings gap is significant. Let's say you did start work, but you have to be self-employed. You can't be a lawyer in a law firm. You can't work with people, let alone be managed by someone who's in a position of power over you, like a partner. And you definitely can't manage staff and deal with their personal issues because they get to know you too well. And that creates barriers. All of those can affect your earning capacity. If they deny it, we need to consider, do we need to start court proceedings or not? Now, the only work I do is in the High Court in London, which is one of the highest courts in the country. 99.9% of our clients want to remain anonymous, and that's totally possible. As a sexual abuse survivor or a child abuse survivor, we will obtain an anonymity order in the High Court, which means no one can publish any details or identify you in any manner. And if we do start court proceedings, only about 2%, 2 to 3% of cases go to an actual trial. The vast majority of them will settle prior to trial. So it's a really important fact. And we don't say that to give comfort to you or to your viewers. It is a true figure because we have to consider as a firm, predominantly we act on a no-win, no-fee basis. How much money do we need to have a reserve in the kind of litigation bank to fund the case from now up to a potential trial? So that's how we do it. And in relation to settlement, we try to achieve not just a financial settlement, but if possible, to achieve an apology, which means a lot to people. You'd be surprised in that sorry is often the hardest word. It also doesn't cost you anything to say sorry, and yet it is the hardest thing to achieve. So to get apologies is significant. Meeting the school can be quite cathartic if you go back to the school or if you meet at a lawyer's office or your house, wherever else. But meeting the school and giving your lived experience to say, we appreciate you're a new head teacher, but if anyone ever suffers abuse in your school from a different teacher or housemaster or just has mental health, issues from other factors. This is what you should do to make them feel able to talk and to express these issues. So meeting the school, apologies, compensation,
Mm,
are really, really important. And then lots of our clients do media as well, to raise awareness. And that in itself helps to chip away at the cycle of abuse, helps to break the silence of abuse. So those are some of the things which we do. Those are some of the kind of standard steps in a case. The
mm.
first step, the biggest step, the most important step is disclosing your abuse. To be frank, if you don't disclose your abuse, it just continues. The impact does. The abuse may be continuing for other children, and things cannot change. And I fully understand why survivors cannot talk, but everything which we can do to break that silence, we're so keen to do, because we can't allow the next generation to be at the same risk and to suffer the same impact as this generation and ones prior to it.
Mm. Yeah, thank you, Dino. That's really clear and really helpful, and something I didn't fully understand how the process might look. And yeah, I appreciate you outlining that. So with what we've talked about so far, making that first disclosure, feeling supported and held by the right therapist, counselor, coach, supportive structure, groups, survivors groups, very key. Coming forward, speaking to a law firm, as we chatted about beforehand, you said it was a bit like finding a therapist. You find someone who you get on with, find someone who gets you, you get them. You're going to be talking about some of the most intimate
Yeah.
parts of your entire life. So, really trust that firm, that lawyer, and we're at that stage now. Perhaps, what could a survivor do? To sort of improve their chances and to resource themselves. Perhaps what information should they have to hand, things like that. Are there any sort of bits of advice there for anyone who may be thinking about coming forward to a legal avenue?
Yeah, so some of the things which we often ask for in the initial kind of consultation, which again is, there's no obligation, and I think it's really important if you do speak to a lawyer, don't think, bloody hell, I've spoken to a lawyer, he's going to charge me now X amount of, hundreds of pounds or whatever else. The initial consultation is always no obligation, it's confidential, and it's free in essence, because you just want to sound out your advice and understand what's happening. Often we need to know, when did the abuse take place, roughly? Not, 10 a.m., 5th of June, 1984, but, oh, it was about 11 or 12. It happened in 1984, 85. How often it happened, the duration, it took place over a week, a month, 6 months. Any specific events you can remember, are important. If you still have school records, if you're still in contact with witnesses, is important as well, because lots of schools do destroy their records. So, for example, Tom, prove you went to this school. How do you prove it? Where's my school records? You destroyed them. I destroyed them because I don't want any memory of that school. I don't speak to any of my peers because I want to distance myself from that school. It's a bit like that saying, isn't it? If you scream in the forest, who hears you scream?
Mm.
It's exactly the same often with schools, um, sadly. So those are factors. But the other factor to consider is to understand what your aims are. And the comment you made before, it should not be anger or revenge. You are entitled to be angry, but you need to be in a place where you can clearly set out in your mind, what are my aims? What do I want to achieve? I want them to admit I suffered abuse. I want them to accept responsibility, to appreciate the impact on me, to apologize for what I've had to go through and continue to go through, to act and to change, to stop other children hopefully suffering abuse. Whatever your wish and demand is, it's really important, because that's the objective. Going through a case, a legal case, is going to be difficult. Speaking to a therapist is not a walk in the park, with absolute respect, Chris, because you're going through painful memories. You're going through emotions and difficulties and feelings which you've bottled up for decades. And it isn't like pop of a champagne bottle. It is something which is festered and is so entrenched, and you're trying to peel away the mold and the layers and the difficulties and everything else. it's hard. So revenge won't work. It has to be, right, I want to achieve this. This is what I went through. This is what I want to achieve. That is so key. If we're able to fulfill those aims, fantastic. That's what we want to do. There's no guarantee the school will apologize. We've had schools who have paid out significant sums in compensation, often have admitted responsibility, but will not say sorry. And you're like, well, why not? Because there's no legal repercussions. You've already settled the case. We've won the case. You admitted it. Why can't you say sorry? They just will refuse to do so. And it's that can cause issues, and that can also cause quite a lot of trauma for abuse survivors. Something else which is important is that when you talk, it's cathartic for you, but then you may then get that rebound going, I've spoken, and actually 10 other people suffered abuse. Well, I feel much better because it wasn't just me, but hold on, there's 10 other people. That feeling is so difficult to process. That kind of relief, it wasn't just me, it wasn't because there was something wrong with me, but also upset, and there were so many others. Some were older than you, so they could have saved me. But some of these boys were younger than me. I could have saved them, and I have guilt now. It is very difficult, very mixed, especially if you've got siblings who went to the same school. It is really hard to process all of those, but you do need to understand that. And especially when we speak to teachers, and you think, Mr. Thomas, Mr. Smith, Mr. Jones were lovely teachers. They were so good. You speak to them, sometimes they know a little bit more than perhaps you anticipated. Or they go, I just don't want to get involved. I don't want to talk. Well, why don't you? You don't know anything. You say you don't know anything. All of those feelings, all of those emotions are quite difficult. And then same as how people portray to receive it, you want them to understand your partner, your family, children, friends. People generally are uneducated about abuse and especially about mental health in this country. Sometimes people will surprise you in a good way and be extremely understanding, good, ask the right questions, but you will always get that idiot going, why did you go back to him for more abuse? Why didn't you punch him? And the one thing I always say is that I'm not dealing with you, Chris, as a 40-year-old big man. I'm dealing with you, Chris, as a 10-year-old child. So have you got a childhood photograph? I've guessed you're 40, by the way, so I apologize. Younger or older. That was just a random number, so I
Very
apologize for
kind of
this one.
you.
Is that okay? Fair enough. Thank God. Yeah.
That's staying
But
up.
yeah. But it's a relevant factor, and I think that's really important because if you get that childhood photograph and you see your eyes through that child, it makes more sense sometimes. If I said to you, Chris, at the age of 10, Santa exists and he comes down your chimney and the world's flat and Man United are the best team in the world, you'll believe me because I'm your teacher, whatever I say you believe. Now, I'm assuming you know Santa doesn't exist, by the way, and Man United are definitely not the best team in the world, and the world isn't flat, as science has shown. But it's important to remember that's what you're dealing with. That's what we're kind of processing. And an adult trying to process a child's emotions and actions is never going to work. So that's why we say again, therapy is not just at the outset disclosing, but at these other key stages. And things like triggers are really important, whereby some people say I'm absolutely fine, but the next thing you know, they've seen someone who looks like the abuser. A song will come on, which is from the same period as when they were abused. They see a car that same color. They will smell a certain food or a certain aftershave, which reminds them of their abuser. All of those can be triggers. So again, therapy is really important for that, not just at the beginning, but also during the process, if possible. It is key, but again, specialist therapy. So not, with total respect, waiting 9 to 12 months for the NHS to have a general specialist who deals with, bereavements on a Monday, divorce on a Tuesday, stress at work at a Wednesday, sexual abuse on a Thursday. It has to be someone who has specific training, who will understand what can and can't be done and the time scale to kind of process these things. We had one case whereby someone saw a therapist and she started crying during the second session when he was disclosing the impact of the abuse on his life. That guy has never seen a therapist again, and that traumatized him so much that the way the therapist reacted, it put him back about 20 steps because he didn't want to be pitied. He didn't want people to display, to cry when he's talking about these issues. He didn't want that. So she wasn't a specialist. It caused her trauma. It wasn't safe for her either.
Mm.
And there's no criticism of her, of the therapist, but it's, again, specialist therapist who knows what they're doing and someone you can bond with. It is
Yeah.
so key and so important. Otherwise, it just doesn't work, and it can actually cause more trauma because you just feel like you don't get it, or you're looking at me a bit weird. Do you get me? Do you understand me?
Yeah, thank you.
Reinforces all those feelings about judgment.
Mm.
It's my fault. You don't understand. I don't want to talk to you about it. It can be really difficult. So I think having the
Yeah.
right therapy when you feel able to have so it
Mm.
is really key. It's
Yeah.
really key.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dina. I think just in general, the way we built the therapist and practitioner directory on Seen and Heard is every one of those professionals has significant experience with boarding schools, independent schools. Firstly, um, all trauma informed, and you speak to most professionals who deal with ex-boarders and ex-independent school pupils a lot as part of their practice, or they've had specialist training with that client group, is that mostly it's complex post-traumatic stress anyway, even without abuse. And often there will be abuse and neglect in there because it was so normalized, because it was part of the structure of how things were done and how things were run. So you, even if you haven't got that sort of let's call it sort of flagship abuse moment, there will be complex post-traumatic stress disorder to work through anyway at some point or another. So thank you for highlighting that. It is so important. Just to bring things to a close, and hugely appreciative of your time and your clarity today. With the law as it stands, we're speaking to each other. You've seen the head covers the UK, covers Scotland, England, Wales, Northern Ireland. We're speaking to each other from England today. There is a difference between the Scottish system and the English and Welsh Northern Irish system. What can I'm hearing quite big disparity, if you like, between what's going on between the cases against institutions in Scotland and in England. Could you just briefly talk into that, and perhaps what England and Wales particularly can do to improve the law or improve the handling of survivors?
Yeah, so in Scotland currently, they obviously have different laws. They have sheriffs and the way they process cases and legal arguments, and even their point on limitations, the time limit, and being able to bring cases is very different to England and Wales. And the one thing I would say is that if you have suffered abuse in a Scottish school, to obtain special advice from a Scottish lawyer, yeah, I think it's really important. One thing which is important to note as well is about the streamlined process in relation to boarding schools and private schools in Scotland, which isn't in place in England. There is no scheme in England for this abuse. It was recommended by the Independent Inquiry into Child Sex Abuse, which was published in October 2022, so very fast, coming up to 2 years, 20 recommendations, nothing has been implemented. One of them was mandatory reporting, which we've mentioned numerous times, was on the Tories' plan towards the end of their time. And obviously, end of government, it's dropped. We don't know if Labour will pick it back up. I really hope so, and as soon as possible, but we'll have to see. One of the other recommendations was for a compensation scheme to facilitate payments to survivors separate to the civil legal process. Now, there's pros and cons to a scheme. Some survivors feel that it takes away the personal nature of the abuse and becomes a lot more methodical. Other abuse survivors say it's much more streamlined and less combative and argumentative. So there are pros and cons. The fact is, in England, you don't have an option. There is only the civil legal redress, which is possible. There is no scheme. And I think in Scotland, it is creating benefits in relation to perhaps the sums received, but more importantly, how many people are receiving successful cases, because the limitation changes and the way the scheme is set up, it is much easier to go through. Abuse survivors should be dealt with as human beings who have suffered significant trauma, and anything which can reduce that should be done. Things like mandatory reporting is not in place in Scotland either. It is in France and most of the developed world. So when we're looking at comparatives, we need to consider other jurisdictions as well for mandatory reporting. But currently with the schemes, we do need one. When we look at the Lambeth scheme for abuse in the children's homes, it's a positive scheme which took place. The Church of England is setting up a scheme currently for abuse within Church of England. Catholic Church are doing nothing, with total respect to them. Boarding schools are not setting up one, scouts are not setting up one, sports clubs are not. So we do need to look at that. And state schools are not setting up a scheme either. So the whole point of the ICSA one is going to encompass and cover a number of those institutions I just mentioned, to streamline the process, to reduce the trauma on survivors. But again, there are pros and cons, whether the sums are lower or it doesn't feel as individual, because you are sometimes ticking a box saying, yes, I suffered this abuse over this period of time, and this is what flows from it. Some survivors do want those findings of guilt and blame against the institution. Yes, you should be, yes, rather than just being a tick box. And the one problem is with schemes as well. The Scottish one seems to be working okay, to be fair, okay to good on the kind of rating level. Perhaps good is probably a fairer assessment. But with schemes, as we've shown, as we know in this country, aren't always great. So when we consider Windrush, not a good scheme, as in just poorly managed and handled. When we consider the post office scandal, not well handled, contaminated blood just starting now. So, a scheme can have benefits if it's managed and run a proper way. The Scottish one is a good starter for 10.
Yeah.
I think I would say. But again, if you suffered abuse in England and Wales, it's pointless me saying to you about the Scottish scheme when it's not replicated here.
Yeah.
And one thing which we do need to do is to express the extent of abuse in this country. I mean, politicians do need to hear this pandemic or epidemic. I always forget which word it is. Apologize, but the scale of abuse in this country, the impact on not just those individuals but everyone else, and the impact on the economy. Because the fact is, for every abuse survivor, it causes an issue for the economy, and sometimes politicians will look towards this rather than other factors, unfortunately. But the strain on the NHS, strain on the criminal justice system, the strain on lack of income tax because people are earning less and not fulfilling their earning capacity. If we're able to bring in these measures to stop abuse, prevent abuse, mandatory reporting, child abuse schemes, it has to be the way forward. It's a false economy just to pretend this is the best way of doing things when it's not. So reason why I'm very keen to work with Seen and Heard is to continue to raise these issues. Raising them is one thing, but we need a solution. And the solution isn't being vengeful, isn't being angry. It's trying to say, look, you need to work with us. It's not us and them. We all live in society. We all shop in Tesco's. We all have children. We need to work on this together to prevent abuse. And that's why it's so important. And we do need to look at jurisdictions like Scotland and elsewhere saying, look, this works well. Let's copy it. Let's do it if it's working well.
Yeah, thank you, Dino. Yeah, I think I was, speaking to Scottish abuse survivors who've come through the boarding in independent schools that are in the cases now. I think I just wanted to touch on that because people will be Googling things, seeing articles and thinking, oh, does that apply to me here? Well, no, it's Scotland. There is a different system here. Some of the things around, the backdating of claims with compound interest and things over the years, making the claims much bigger in Scotland. That isn't, I believe, the case here in England and Wales. And the statute of limitations, as far as you mentioned, you touched on it briefly, but just to clarify, you talked about someone's 21st birthday. Could you just briefly clarify what that is for England and Wales?
Yeah, so for cases in England and Wales, you have technically until your 21st birthday to register your case at court. That's because you were abused as a child. Instead of having the usual statutory 3-year limit, you have 3 years from the age of majority, so age of 18. So if you suffered abuse as a child, 21st birthday, unless there's capacity issues. Now, most of our clients are in their 40s plus, like I mentioned. So what we need to rely upon is Section 33 of the Limitation Act 1980. And in principle, it has 2 criteria. One, to show a fair trial is still possible, even though it's out of time. So are we able to prove the abuse? Are we able to prove the institution should be held responsible? Are we able to prove this is an impact on you and the level and extent of that impact? And the second criteria, which I've always disagreed with because I think it is victim blaming, why did you not come forward earlier? Now, if the first criteria has been satisfied, a fair trial is possible. The second criteria, in my personal view, shouldn't be in play because it's victim blaming, but we have to justify it. So why did you not come forward earlier? Elements of blame, embarrassment, shame, fear of people in authority. We have to go through those criteria and we have to justify it. It becomes harder when you've told your partner when you're 25 and you're spoken to a therapist when you're 35. You haven't started legal case until you're 45. You have to justify those different sections of your life. Obviously, telling your partner is very different to telling some random lawyer. I get that. Seeking medical help and support from a therapist is very different to, again, pursuing a legal action through the police and or a civil lawyer. I appreciate the differences, but we do need to justify those steps. And I think that one thing which we are campaigning for and continue to campaign for is that second element should be removed because it's inherently difficult for abuse survivors to talk about abuse. So we shouldn't need to prove that. But that's the current rules in the country of England and Wales. The vast majority of our clients, 98%, 99%, are all over the age of 21. So it's the norm, to be frank, that happens. And we are successful for our clients. So it's an issue which we see every single day. We're fully aware of. But again, 2 to 3% under 21. Some of them are in their 20s, but they're still out of time. Even if you're a day over 21, you're out of time technically.
Yeah, it seems crazy to me, just as someone who works with people who've experienced abuse and trauma, to put that limitation in place there. But what I'm hearing from you is that, if someone to Google these things, they might be put off instantly and go, well, I'm 50, I'm not 21, so what's the point? But what you're saying is,
Yeah.
all it means is that the legal team has to do some work on some of those other elements. Such as why didn't you come forward up till now, and substantiate that, and and what was the other one? Sorry, is to substantiate why you didn't come forward.
And to show that a fair trial is possible.
So
Same
fair
as
trial as possible.
same as you think, what's the point? My abuse is dead. Same point in that we have been able to bring civil action successfully on a number of occasions against dead abusers, or where perhaps there was insufficient evidence. We pursue a civil case and sometimes actually results in a criminal case because the police haven't been able to, for some reason, to reach out to survivors and the like. It is possible, it is doable. And remember, Jimmy Savile, as an example, was never charged or convicted of abuse, but it was found in the civil that he was, on balance probabilities, an abuser. So I think, again, the key thing is speaking, even if the civil lawyers say they cannot assist, the signposting is important.
Yes.
So whether it's to therapists, MPs, inquiries, wherever it is, it goes back to that initial point. What do you want to achieve from doing this? Yeah. What elements of closure and justice do you want? And how do you achieve it? And what's the kind of balance for you as well? What input it's going to have? So it's really important to kind of reach out to individuals.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Dino. You've really made it very clear, because I think the speaking up, bringing it into reality, if you like, acknowledgement from friends, family, community, the seeking of trying to change things for others, as well as for if you like, for your inner child, and you talked about that a little bit. So to see things through the eyes of the age that you were when you were a young person, when the abuse happens, when you're at school. So yeah, it's been hugely helpful today, to hear from you about the process, and just to sort of summarize a little bit. So with some of the elements of what people could do if they want to come forward, was to look at when it happened, how often, frequency and things like that, any specific events, what the duration was of the abuse, were there any school records available, any witnesses, so any people that were around at the same sort of time that could corroborate what happened, or may have had similar experiences that you shared into your peers and so forth. And then, very importantly, at the end, you talked about think about the aims and objectives, your wish list. What do you want to get out of this? Not necessarily just revenge. Okay, it's it's something more holistic than that. And then at that point, just say something. Just start the conversation with the support of the right therapist and support team, friends, family, etc., and then come and speak to a law firm where you feel comfortable held, and you get on well with your lawyer. So yeah, as we bring things to a close, is there anything else you wanted to finish with before we close today?
No, it's great. Thank you so much for speaking to me and for helping to raise this issue. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dino. And we'll ensure all these resources are put together on our childhood abuse survivors hub on Seed and Head, and we'll make all this available for people. So I'll stop the recording now. But thank you very much, Dino.